Why was David Ruffin fired from the Temptations?
Well, you see, when we first started out, we made a vow that we would not change, because we had heard about Frankie Lyman leaving the Teenagers. And
for years, the story of David Ruffin's fall felt like scattered headlines and hushed memories. The man who once lit up every stage had vanished from the spotlight, leaving more questions than answers. Otis Williams stayed silent through the noise, carrying a version of the truth he rarely shared. But time has a way of catching up, and the weight of what really happened never left him. This is the side of the story the world didn't hear until he finally decided to tell it. The golden era and the silent rivalry. The Temptations were soaring, Motown's crown jewel. Every stage they stepped on turned into gold, and every song was a chart climber. From My Girl to Ain't Too Proud to Beg, the harmonies were flawless, the moves were electric. But behind the sharp suits and smooth smiles, something was bubbling under the surface. And Otis Williams saw it all. Now, David Ruffin didn't just join the Temptations, he changed them. His voice had grit, emotion, that preacher-like howl that turned love songs into spiritual experiences. Berry Gordy knew it, the fans knew it, and deep down, Otis knew it too. For a while, Otis admired him. He welcomed David's fire, his ambition, even his hunger to push boundaries. But as the spotlight narrowed in on Ruffin, it cast long shadows on the rest, especially Otis. In Otis's own memoir, Temptations, he recalls how David started craving more than just recognition - he wanted control. He'd show up late to rehearsals, demand that the group be renamed David Ruffin and the Temptations. He'd make Otis and the others wait in limos while he traveled separately, often in a mink coat behind tinted windows. But Otis didn't just see arrogance, he saw insecurity. There were moments in interviews and on stage where David would flicker, smiles hiding exhaustion, jokes masking frustration. In later years, Otis confessed that David's ego wasn't just about fame, it came from something deeper, a wounded pride, a need to prove his worth in a world that never gave him much. Born to a harsh upbringing in Mississippi, David was raised by a strict minister father. Discipline came with belts and fists. Music was his only escape. So when Motown handed him a mic, he wasn't just singing. He was fighting for survival, for power, for love. Otis, the quiet leader, saw how those scars never left. They never yelled at each other in front of the band. There were no explosive arguments caught on camera, but the tension was always there, silent, pressing. David's brilliance was blinding, but it was burning the group from the inside. And Otis, no matter how much he tried to steady the ship, couldn't ignore the cracks forming beneath the gold. What no one knew back then was that their biggest hits were being recorded during some of their lowest personal moments. David was slipping, and Otis was watching a brother lose himself to the very thing that made him great. This was no ordinary rivalry. It was a collision of pain and pride, ambition and fear. And as Otis later admitted, the signs were all there. He just didn't know how far it would go. But brilliance like David's doesn't just fade, it lashes out. And Otis was about to learn what it really means when a star begins to fall. Fame, fractures, and the turning point. The first real crack didn't show during a concert. It showed in a studio booth in Detroit. The group had assembled to record another hit, and David Ruffin had promised to meet them there by noon. Otis checked his watch every 15 minutes. No one had heard from David all morning. By 4 p.m., the band packed up and left. The track went unfinished. Motown's engineers filed a report. That session, like too many others in 1968, had gone off the rails because David never walked through the door. Back then, they didn't have to guess where he'd gone. The rumors moved faster than the records. One of the label's secretaries had seen him the night before at a party on the west side of Detroit, surrounded by models, liquor bottles, and enough powder to cloud the room. When Otis heard that, he didn't react. He just nodded and stared down at his hands. Motown was panicking behind the scenes. Promoters were calling to cancel appearances. Managers were being told to prepare backup plans. Otis remembered one night when Berry Gordy pulled him aside after a meeting and asked quietly, "Can you hold this together?" That question didn't have a clear answer anymore. In April of that year, the group had a performance scheduled in Baltimore. It was a major venue packed with thousands of fans. David had confirmed he'd fly in the night before. Otis even arranged a private car to pick him up from the airport. The driver waited for 2 hours. No one came off the plane. The group performed that show with a backup singer who had learned the steps 2 days earlier. The audience noticed, the press called it sloppy. David never called to explain. 3 days later, he showed up at a Motown event in Los Angeles wearing sunglasses, holding hands with a different woman, acting like nothing had happened. Otis started writing things down. Not out of anger, out of fear. He knew David had stopped listening. He wasn't reachable through reason. The man who once lived for rehearsals now lived by impulse. He wouldn't return phone calls. He skipped meetings. He missed studio bookings. One evening, Eddie Kendricks found him passed out in a friend's apartment in Detroit, surrounded by strangers. When Eddie called Otis to describe the scene, he didn't raise his voice. He just said, "It's getting dangerous." The illicit substance use had reached a level no one could cover up. People close to David began saying he had started carrying around a gold-plated inhaler filled with crushed illegal substances. At parties, he used it in plain sight. The same man who once arrived early for shows now needed to be dragged from hotel rooms. One Motown staffer wrote in a company memo that David had missed 5 sessions in a row, including one where Smokey Robinson had flown in specifically to work with him. Smokey left the building that day without saying a word. Otis didn't want to believe the worst, but denial had already cost them months. The group had been forced to cancel performances in Kansas City, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. Refunds were draining their tour budget. In Minneapolis, Otis personally faced a crowd furious over David's absence. Fans booed him. One man in the front row yelled, "Where's the real temptation?" Backstage, Otis slammed a door so hard the frame cracked. That night, he didn't speak to anyone. The turning point came in New York. The group sat down in a Manhattan office, just the 5 original members. No lawyers, no executives, just them. Melvin Franklin sat with his arms folded, staring at the floor. Paul Williams kept his hands clasped and his head low. Eddie Kendricks didn't speak until the very end. Otis led the conversation. He listed the missed concerts, the failed recordings, the money lost, and then he said something that silenced the room. "If we don't make this choice now, there won't be a group left to save." No one interrupted him. When the vote came, no one raised their voice. Melvin gave a slow nod. Paul blinked a few times, then whispered his agreement. Eddie stood up, walked to the window, and stayed quiet. Otis didn't have to ask what that meant. That night, management received official word. David Ruffin would be removed from the Temptations. Otis didn't celebrate, he didn't sleep. The next morning, a phone rang inside Motown's Detroit office. It wasn't David, it was his road manager. The message, "He knows, he says it's your loss." Otis read that message twice, then tore it in half. 3 days later, Otis made it official. He contacted Shelley Berger, the group's manager, and gave him the green light. Motown quietly drafted the paperwork. By the end of the week, the search for a replacement had begun. But David Ruffin didn't step back, he came back swinging. In July, he began showing up at concerts uninvited. One night in Virginia, during a performance by the new lineup with Dennis Edwards, David walked past security, entered through a side door, and stood in the wings of the stage. As the group sang "Ain't Too Proud to Beg," David ran onto the platform and grabbed a microphone. The audience roared. For a few seconds, everything froze. Dennis Edwards stepped back. Otis kept singing. The band didn't stop the music. David finished the chorus like he never left. Security stood by, unsure whether to drag him off or let it play out. By the end of the song, the crowd stood on its feet. David took a bow and left the stage without a word. That stunt didn't just happen once. He repeated it again in Pennsylvania, again in Ohio. Each time, the crowd responded with cheers. But behind the scenes, promoters grew nervous. Legal threats surfaced. Motown issued private warnings. If he interrupted again, lawsuits would follow. After David's final interruption, Otis met with the group privately. He told them no one would be allowed backstage without clearance. Every show after that ran like clockwork. But something changed in the way Otis carried himself. The man who had kept the group together for nearly a decade had just pushed out its loudest voice and watched him crash the stage like a ghost refusing to be forgotten. Otis later admitted he didn't know if they had done the right thing. The damage had been piling up for too long. The cost of doing nothing had started outweighing the risk of letting him go. but the guilt never really left. Firing David ended the chaos on stage, but off stage, Otis was about to face the hardest chapter yet: the regrets that haunt Otis. David Ruffin finally left the Temptations in 1968, but he never truly left Otis Williams. In the years that followed, David's solo career climbed, stumbled, then collapsed. His debut album, My Whole World Ended, reached the Billboard Top 10, but the success didn't last. The industry that once chased his name began stepping around it. Missed studio sessions, burned bridges, drug charges. By 1979, the same voice that once shook concert halls found itself locked in silence more often than in song. Otis kept watching from the sidelines. He didn't say much publicly, but privately he carried it. There were times they crossed paths at industry events, moments where David tried to flash the same old charm. Otis saw through it. The edge had dulled. The eyes didn't lie. In 1983, they reunited for a Motown 25 performance. That moment felt electric on stage, but off stage, Otis felt something different. David had changed. The fire still burned, but it flickered more than it roared. Behind the curtain, David leaned into Otis and whispered, "We should have never let it go like that." Otis nodded. He didn't know what to say. That sentence stayed with him. By the late 80s, David was struggling. Drug arrest in Philadelphia, erratic behavior, missed court appearances. In 1987, he got arrested at a Detroit illegal substance house with over $30,000 in cash and a stash of drugs. He posted bail the next day and went right back on tour. The spiral kept tightening. On June 1st, 1991, Otis got the call. David Ruffin had been found unconscious in a West Philadelphia hospital. Hours earlier, he had checked in using a false name. He had overdosed on illegal substances after spending the night with a known dealer. He didn't survive the morning. He died alone in the emergency room, his identity unknown until later that day. Otis didn't speak right away. He processed the news in silence. When reporters reached him, he kept it brief. But when he wrote about it later, the weight poured through the pages. He described it as a pain that didn't come all at once. It settled in pieces, slowly, permanently. At the funeral, Otis sat close to the casket. He kept his head low, but his mind wandered through years of rehearsals, concerts, hotel lobbies, and backstage standoffs. David had driven the group to the edge, but he had also given it wings. That tension never resolved, and now it never could. Years later, Otis spoke about David during an interview. His voice didn't shake, but something in it cracked just slightly when he said, "No matter what happened, I loved him. He was my brother." That sentence carried everything: the fights, the fear, the final goodbye. When the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted the Temptations in 1989, David had stood beside Otis. The smiles came easy, the speeches came short, but the moment felt full. Like maybe for one night they had stepped outside the wreckage and stood on something solid again. Otis never erased David's name from the story. He never rewrote history. Even when new singers came and went, even when the Temptations changed their sound, their style, and their faces, Otis kept David in the heart of it all. He didn't remember him as a problem. He remembered him as a force, as the man who gave pain a melody, as the friend who spiraled too far but once stood in a booth and delivered My Girl in a single take that silenced the building. Time didn't soften the truth, but it gave Otis enough distance to hold both sides of it: the brilliance, the brokenness, the bond. David Ruffin burned fast and left early. But in the soul of Otis Williams and in the music that still spins 6 decades later, that voice keeps echoing, and it never sounds like a mistake. Was David Ruffin a lost cause, or a legend who needed someone to fight harder for him? Some stories never find peace, they just linger in the silence left behind. Otis Williams may have kept the truth buried for years, but now that it's out, the weight feels heavier than ever. If this story stayed with you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice keeps these stories alive.